Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to build complete conceptual mastery of CBSE History Chapter 4, the Age of Industrialization. Now, I really want you to think of the Industrial Revolution not just as some isolated event that happened way off in Europe, but as a massive, heavy stone dropped into a global pond. It created this enormous ripple effect, an absolute shockwave that traveled across oceans and continents, eventually crashing right onto the shores of India. By the end of this explainer, you're going to understand exactly how the global economy completely transformed, how it impacted the daily lives and livelihoods of Indian weavers, and how our early Indian entrepreneurs rose up to the challenge. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's start with a bit of a paradox. If I ask you to close your eyes and picture industrialization, what do you see? Did you immediately imagine tall brick smokestacks pouring out soot? Well, what if I told you that large-scale industrial production actually started long before those factories ever even existed? I know it sounds totally impossible, right? But it's true, and understanding this little twist is the absolute key to unlocking this whole chapter. So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll look at the world before the factories, the clash between hand labor and steam power, the decline of Indian textiles, the rise of early Indian entrepreneurs, and finally, we'll check your understanding. Let's kick things off with Section 1, before the factories. We actually call this early phase proto-industrialization. Now, proto is just a fancy prefix that indicates the first or early form of something, kind of like a prototype. So proto-industrialization is just the early form of industrialization. It was large-scale, it was absolutely meant for a huge international market, but it happened entirely before factories were built. How on earth did that work? Well, the production was controlled by wealthy merchants in towns, but the actual physical work, that was done by everyday peasants out in the countryside. Picture this. It's the 17th and 18th centuries, and European merchants are traveling out to the countryside, handing out advance money to peasants to produce goods. And you might be wondering, why would peasants agree to this? Well, open fields were disappearing, and their traditional farming incomes were shrinking fast, so whole families eagerly took these cash advances to spin yarn right inside their own little cottages. It was a massive, highly organized operation. A single merchant could control hundreds of workers, with 20 to 25 workers employed at each stage of production, all operating straight from their rural family farms. Moving on to Section 2, hand labor and steam power. Now, when machines finally did arrive, you'd probably assume everyone instantly switched over to using them, right? Actually, no. In Victorian Britain, wealthy industrialists often still preferred human hand labor. Why? Because poor peasants were flooding into the cities, making human labor incredibly cheap and abundant. Plus, a lot of industries, like breweries, only needed workers for a specific season. But here's the most fascinating part. British aristocrats actually preferred handmade goods. To them, handmade meant luxury, refinement, and intricate, careful designs. Machine-made goods? Those were considered inferior, standardized items just mass-produced for export to the colonies. This perfectly illustrates the reality of the time. Even in 1849, deep into this new era, you don't see automated robots in a railway works fitting shop. You see men swinging hammers. The typical mid-19th century worker was not just pushing buttons on a machine. They were traditional craftspeople, making and repairing locomotive engines by hand. The shift to total machine dominance was surprisingly slow. All right, let's look at Section 3, decline of Indian textiles. Because before those British machines took over, India was the undisputed global king of textiles. Fine Indian silk and cotton absolutely dominated the international markets. Armenian and Persian merchants took these beautiful goods from incredibly vibrant Indian ports like Surat and shipped them across the globe. And this entire massive empire rested squarely on the shoulders of the individual rural artisan, weaving intricate cloth at their loom. But as we're about to see, colonial rule would soon shatter this entire system. Once the East India Company gained real political power, they acted like a ruthless, modern monopoly. They wanted to guarantee a steady supply of cheap cotton and silk, and they used a very specific three-step playbook to get it. Step 1, aggressively eliminate any competing traders to totally monopolize trade rights. Step 2, cut out the local Indian merchants entirely and deal directly with the weavers. And Step 3, trap those weavers with a system of advances, giving them loans that legally locked them into exclusive contracts with the company. And you definitely need to remember this term for your exams, the gomasta. A gomasta was a paid servant appointed by the company specifically to supervise the weavers, collect supplies, and examine the cloth. Now, traditional Indian merchants often lived in the villages and helped weavers out during tough times. Not the Gamastas. They were harsh outsiders. They would literally march into villages backed by armed sepoys and punish weavers for any delays with beatings. They were the direct, heavy hand of colonial control. I want you to really step into the shoes of the Indian weavers for a second. They were facing utter desolation. Because of those exclusive contracts, they completely lost their space to bargain for better prices. The loans tied them to the company, meaning they couldn't even grow crops on their own land anymore, because 100% of their time went into weaving just to pay off the debt. Whole villages were abandoned, as weavers fled into the countryside just to escape the Gamastas. As the commissioner of Patna noted, a brisk, thriving trade had just completely died away. But shockingly, the worst was actually yet to come. By the 19th century, British industrialists heavily pressured the East India Company to start selling their British-manufactured goods right inside Indian markets. To put this in perspective, earlier, there was virtually zero import of cotton goods into India. India was the exporter, but by the 1870s, British cotton piece goods constituted over 50% of all Indian imports. The Indian market was completely flooded with foreign cloth. So our Indian weavers were suddenly facing a catastrophic twin blow. First, in the 1850s, their local market completely collapsed, glutted with those cheap machine-made imports from Manchester. Our weavers just couldn't compete with those rock-bottom machine prices. Then, just as they were gasping for air, the 1860s hit. The American Civil War broke out, which completely cut off Britain's supply of raw cotton from the U.S. So, where did Britain turn? They turned to India to buy up all the raw cotton. The results? The price of raw cotton in India absolutely skyrocketed. Our Indian weavers couldn't even afford to buy the raw materials they needed to weave their cloth. They were literally starved of supplies. Let's move to Section 4, Early Indian Entrepreneurs. Because the story doesn't end in defeat. You might be wondering, where did the capital, the massive amounts of money needed to build the first Indian mills, actually come from? Fascinatingly enough, it came primarily from the China trade. The British were exporting opium from India to China, and then taking tea from China back to England. Indian businessmen very smartly acted as junior players in this massive trade network, financing, procuring supplies, and managing shipping. Through this hustle, they accumulated significant wealth. And more importantly, they developed a grand vision for indigenous Indian industries. Incredible visionaries emerged across the country. Dwarkanath Tagore in Bengal, brilliant Parsi businessmen like Dinshaw Pettit and Jamsetji Tata in Bombay, and Marwari businessmen like Seth Hukamchand, who set up the very first Indian jute mill in Calcutta. They were the ones building our industrial foundation. And I want you to notice their brilliant strategic pivot here. Initially, early Indian mills mostly produced coarse yarn for handlooms or for export to China, but after 1906, they faced tough new competition from Japanese and Chinese mills, and Indian yarn exports declined. But concurrently, right here at home, the nationalist Swadeshi movement was heavily mobilizing Indians to boycott all foreign cloth. Seeing this incredible dual opportunity, Indian industrialists rapidly shifted their factories from just spinning yarn to weaving actual finished cloth. Because of this brilliant pivot, Indian cotton piece goods production literally doubled between 1900 and 1912. All right, team, Section 5. Let's do a quick check your understanding. Let's test your conceptual mastery. Say it out loud right wherever you're sitting. First statement. The international market for fine textiles was dominated by India till the 18th century. Based on our discussion about the vibrant port of Surat? Yes, that is absolutely true. Okay, second statement. The American Civil War resulted in the reduction of cotton exports from India. Think back to those twin blows. When America stopped sending cotton, Britain bought it all from India, so exports didn't reduce, they skyrocketed, leaving our weavers starved. So this statement is false. Excellent work today, everyone. You have truly achieved conceptual mastery of this complex, heavy chapter. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. The age of industrialization wasn't just a simple, straight line of machines replacing humans. It was a fierce, messy, global struggle for economic survival. It was absolutely a story of colonial exploitation, yes, but it was also a story of incredible adaptation, hustle, and resilience by Indian artisans and visionary entrepreneurs. Their fight, quite literally, laid the foundation for the thriving, independent economy we live in today. Keep exploring, keep questioning everything, and I will see you in the next explainer.